So today we're going to talk a little bit about validation. What is validation? And pretty specifically focused on software validation in particular. We will get into CSV to CSA, why the change, what's new here. And we'll go through what a modern validation or assurance package looks like. I know there's a lot of questions there. A lot of us are figuring out what this looks like. How are we going to implement? And we've got some good guidance for you. And we will also make the slides available to you after the webinar as well, so you'll have this information to take along. So again, absolutely thrilled. Sean, if you'd like to do a quick introduction, I would appreciate it. I'm so glad to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Kelly. Thank you for the invitation. My name's Sion Wyn from Wales in the UK, and I'm one of the members of the first founding GAMP committee, and I've been involved in most of the major GAMP documents over the years, and I'm still very actively involved. And I had the honour and pleasure of working very closely with FDA on the re-examination of Part 11, and I'm really delighted that the FDA are taking these steps to refresh and reset some of the old traditional industry ideas that are still out there on computer systems validation and assurance. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much again, Sean. Really appreciate it. And I'm Kelly Stanton. I'm the Director of Quality here at Qualio. We are a EQMS software tool supporting the life sciences industry across the world. We have customers all over the world. And while obviously today we're going to talk a lot about FDA as it relates specifically to this implementation, GAMP is a globally recognized guideline. And I do expect that the EU regs, UK, et cetera, will be also going through these exercises very soon. So again, Qualio, we're an EQMS software tool. We are a fully remote distributed company, so we're kind of all over the world. And again, if you want more information on our software, happy to follow up with you after the presentation. So today, let's talk about validation. Let's kind of level the playing field a little bit, so we're all starting from the same kind of understanding. Validation by definition is the confirmation by examination of objective evidence that software specifications conform to user needs and intended uses, and that the particular requirements implemented through software could be consistently fulfilled. And so from that definition we get, is your software fit for your intended use in a regulated GXP environment? And we all know we've got ways we've gone about this in the past. And obviously today we'll talk about how this is looking going forward. So from a historic perspective, computerized systems and drug establishments, or back in the day, 1983, the Blue Book, obviously this technology was new, and there was I think a lot of fear around it in general. And I would say it probably still feels a little bit that way of how is this going to help the process? What is the software going to do? Or what are the computer systems doing that humans are no longer doing, or paper, we're not generating paper records for. And so, obviously at the time it was, kind of new hardware, a lot of documentation around how things were set up, organized. We all had server rooms in the middle of our facilities that were under lock and key with special air conditioning and all that good stuff. Yeah, really in the 80s, computers really started to find their way into the life sciences industry in general. The original guideline on process validation from the agency was released back in 1986, and really spoke to, what are the expectations for showing that these systems are suitable for their intended use. And we went into some pretty, big detail on components, configuration, how things were set up, who had access to it, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, 1986 feels like a lifetime ago. In 2002, actually 1997, updated in 2002, we had the general principles of software validation guidance that was released by the agency. And 2002. This again feels like a lifetime ago. Technology has come a long way since then. And then, around that, you have a lot of other guidelines and things that have come into play. In 2022, we finally have an update on computer software assurance for production and quality system software that was released by the FDA back on September 13th. And of course, in the mix as well, we've had GAMP, the Good Automated Manufacturing process as well. And that was updated last summer in July. Why do we validate? Why do we care? Computers always work the same way, right? Shouldn't have to worry about it. This particular incident occurred, and this is, more specifically to software as a medical device, but people were dying, unfortunately. And so a lot of scrutiny put onto, this fatal radiation dose in therapy was related to the computer system having an issue. So there are definitely scenarios where our software can cause injury to patient. And, and so the guidelines around that are based on that expectation that you're assessing things from that perspective. Can this hurt my patient or result in a product problem? So at this point, around 24% of medical device recalls, again, governed by the FDA, are triggered by software faults. So again, high scrutiny, but also injury to patient. So if we switch over to CSV, or computer software validation, what are we really talking about? Why are we changing things? And before we dive into this too far, we're going to do a quick poll here. And so Kieran, if you can fire off that poll for us, thank you. Where are you in the conversion to CSA from CSV? You're fully implemented and you're off and running. You've got this implemented into your validation program. Are you on the path to implementation, but you're still working on it? You've got a ways to go, or maybe you're still trying to figure out what that looks like. Or what's CSA? You're not really sure even what this is about. So if you would, please answer the poll here. We'll give it a few more seconds to get answers in. All right, let's see where we're at. Interesting, yeah, and I kind of expected this. It is relatively a new shift in direction from a validation perspective. So 7% of you are fully implemented, 44% of you are on the path to implementation but have a ways to go, and 49% or half of you are here to learn even what CSA is about. So thanks for sharing those answers, and I hope that we will answer some of your questions as we go along. So why the change? Well, under the old CSV, or computer software validation approach to things, the regulators recognize that we are mired in redundant duplication of efforts, unnecessary tasks that sole purpose is for checking boxes. We're not actually really looking at the software from a more holistic approach. And we're doing this out of fear. The old guidances told us you must do IQ, OQ, PQ to be validated. And we've all just sort of blindly done that without considering that there are other ways to go about it, or that it might be a monumental waste of time to do it. So again, we're relying on outdated validation documents like IQ, OQ, PQ. And those, for those of you working with, either software as a medical device, or, in more knowledgeable of the software industry and how development actually works, you probably see that IQ, OQ, PQ and those kinds of documents, they don't fit well with when you talk about agile software development, for example, which is really the ideal way to go about developing software. You change enough a round hole. And And then again, the bigger problem, the biggest problem that the regulators see happening is that people are just choosing not to implement software into their processes because they view it as a time-consuming, laborious, and painful process. And then once it's there, you can't ever change it, because if you change it, you have to revalidate again. And again, this has really stifled innovation in our industry. The regulators recognize that, and they've been trying to figure out how to address that as a problem. And so, yeah, it's very comfortable to follow, sort of that checkbox methodology. Yeah, you've got to have an IQ. Do you have one? Check. Does it have, X, Y, and Z in it? Check. And not really thinking about or understanding what's really happening with the software, and the fact that, if you can check the box, you can, put it out of your mind and you don't have to think about it anymore. And so, and then when auditors walk through the door, you're speaking the same language. You don't have to explain your thought process about how you did it, because you followed the guidance, and here's the checklist of the things, and that's what the auditors expect to see. Except in reality, what they see is that you're kind of just turning your brain off and following without really understanding, having that good, deep understanding of how this actually in the context of your business and your processes. We end up, with mountains of paperwork. The first time I ever did an EQMS implementation, I had 3 4-inch binders that sat on a shelf in our library, and that was the IQ-OQ-PQ documentation for the software. I always found it kind of ironic that we had such a massive amount of paper to prove that a computer system thing worked. That's kind of how that was looking. And so we're comfortable with that. We're used to that. We're used to our mountains of paperwork. And so, it's easier to just stick with that again, because it's familiar, it's safe. So in reality, it's become a very self-perpetuating problem, because because we're afraid to take some risk here and implement a tool that's going to make things better, we stick to paper. Paper begets more paper. You end up with very bloated processes, half of which exist solely for the purpose of supporting everything being on paper. It's a little bit crazy that way. And so, we have huge document control departments whose whole job in life is to keep track of all the pieces of paper we're generating as part of our processes. And so again, so we stick to paper because we're afraid to change, and that just begets more paper. And, it really contributes to, okay, I'm seeing some chatter that my connection is not very good. I think what I'm going to do is stop my video for a bit and see if that improves. If that improves your ability to hear me. Let me know if that continues to be a problem. All right. So hopefully that's better. Moving on. So when we don't digitize, what we do as a quality team is spend way too much time, up to 25% of our working day just doing administrative work, generating spreadsheets, chasing up paper. I used to joke when I was a quality specialist in a paper system in a big office that we were walking around the building looking for red folders because we would lose change controls. No, I literally mean printed paper. I literally mean chasing printed paper around the facility. We would send a change control packet around with the red lines of the procedure we wanted, the new procedure, and the change control form on top. And those would get lost on people's desks. So one of our corrections was to put that in a red folder. And so then I would walk around the facility looking for red folders and trying to keep them moving to see who else needed to to sign off whatever it is I was after. But yeah, this is 25% of people's working day spending, on these administrative type tasks, and having to have whole large departments to do these type of tasks. So again, this is all of this paper we generate is viewed as the protective layer. How do we, get through audits safely? Well, it's more paper. If I roll into my FDA, inspection room with parts full of binders, full of documentation, that must mean I'm doing everything correct, right? And we all took comfort in what that looked like. But the problem is you're actually wasting a ton of time and your focus is not in the right place. You're repeating testing activities that were already performed by the vendor. And in software, that always used to drive me nuts. It's the same, you get the disk from the vendor and it would have the software version number on it, and you pop it in and you start running it and it would pop up and it would be the same version that they tested. Well, it's software, and it's a copy of the software. Why is it going to behave any differently? And it was mind-boggling to me. I never used to understand why we were doing that. Also, not letting your software's risk profile guide your validation activity. We'll talk a little bit more about risk assessment later in this presentation, but not every piece of software in your facility is high risk. It's not. And the regulators don't expect it to be. And if you are treating it that way, they immediately know that your focus is in the wrong place. Testing by default whenever a new software update rolls out. If without really considering what's the change, what's the actual impact of the change, how maybe, if all they're doing is a refresh of the user interface, but no functionality changed, why are you running a full validation on that? That is a complete waste of time. Demanding IQ, OQ, PQs from your software vendors. So I come from industry. I'm with the software vendor right now, but my majority of my career was spent in industry. And so we get asked this all the time. Well, where's your IQ? Like, you're not installing it. You don't need an IQ, right? It's already been installed, and we have the documentation that shows that it's working appropriately. You don't need to have a full copy of that yourself. And lastly, conducting your full battery of tests on your own instance in multi-tenancy situations. So a lot of software has moved to the cloud and it's multi-tenant. What that means is everyone is actually using the same application. Your data is segregated logically by the code within the system. So your functionality in your instance is not any different than the other 499 customers using that same application. How are you adding value by retesting that functionality? You're not, is the short answer. So the FDA has identified that an excessive focus on compliance rather than quality diverts resources and management attention towards meeting regulatory compliance requirements rather than adopting best quality practices. This is straight from GAMP, the Enabling Innovation Good Practice Guide. Highly recommend you get your hands on a copy of that. It's a great document. And it will really help you start to retool your thinking about what's really the risk here of using this software. So what is CSA all about? Computer Software Assurance, CSA. Again, critical thinking, risk-based adoption of computerized tools. What is this software going to do in my facility? How am I going to use it? And does it have any direct impact to product quality, patient safety? And if the answer to that is no, then why are you validating it to the same extent as maybe, say, your manufacturing software on a piece of equipment that does control product quality? It's very important that we start to differentiate between the different the different risks associated with the different things. Jettison of unnecessary legacy validation documents like IQ, OQ, PQ. In a cloud-based multi-tenant software situation where they are following industry standard software development lifecycle model, you are repeating testing that the vendor has already done. And again, not even on a unique instance of the software. So why are you doing this? You're wasting time. Eliminate the fear of regulatory inflexibility as a blocker to the adoption of new technology. I was at the PDA FDA joint conference last fall. Several of the presentations that I sat through were FDA inspectors or FDA division heads who stood on stage and said, why are people still doing this? You are wasting your time. You are wasting your company resources. You really need to be focused on those high-risk systems, the things that can actually cause a problem from a patient perspective. So what we're trying to do here is return to the original spirit of GAMP. And I've got Sion here to talk about that a little bit more, but this really isn't a change. So in the original GAMP guidance, the intent was absolutely prove your computerized system is fit for intended use, ensuring your computerized system meets the basic baselines of compliance, and manage any residual risk to patients and to the quality of the final medicinal product. Sion, if you want to add any more color to this particular area we're talking about.
Yes, thank you very much. I agree. That's a great summary there of GAMP objectives, and what we're talking about under the banner of CSA is not a change to good practice. It reflects good practice, but it's not a change to good practice. It's not a set of requirements or expectations that have now been foisted on the industry. It's just reflecting where good practice has got to, but perhaps also reflects that some companies, many companies perhaps, have been left behind and don't actually follow good practice. So rather than as a set of expectations, I see it very much as an opportunity to refocus on what is important. And it's a reminder that the focus should be on the patient and the quality of the product rather than the inspector. And it's a reminder to actually apply today's current good practice and to apply current modern software development and life cycle management techniques, because what's stated in the CSA draft is completely compatible with GAMP 5 second edition. It's not prescriptive, the draft. It's as is written on all FDA FDA guidance documents. It doesn't confer any rights and responsibilities, and alternative approaches are completely okay as long as they satisfy regulations. But actually, there's a very good harmony between the objectives and the approach in the guide and what's in the various GAMP documents. It states in the guidance itself, it's not intended to be a complete description of software validation. It can't be. There's 20 pages of guidance there, whereas GAMP is 400 pages, and that itself is not intended to be a complete description of how to manage and develop software systems, because that's a wider topic. So I see this as a catalyst, and I welcome the fact that there's a new term, because that gets rid of perhaps some of the baggage associated. We've for 30 years that activities have been ingrained and grown up around this term CSV. So great, I like the approach of, okay, let's have a new term to show that the industry really needs to wake up and do something about this.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. The regulators want us to digitize. They want us to really embrace these modern tools. They recognize that these things are absolutely useful, and they improve patient outcomes. They improve product quality because you're not focusing resources in places that are not value added or can't have a direct impact on your patients. So again, this leads to higher adoption, faster, simpler computerized system onboarding. And someone asked, does this apply also to software that is not cloud-based? Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. This doesn't only have to be cloud-based. And I think that'll make a little bit of sense once we kind of get down into some of the nitty-gritty there. But yes, this is laying it out in a way that makes sense and considers risks always, and then takes it from there. All right. Forward, there we go. So again, part of the trend, and Sean spoke to this a little bit here, the regulators are really trying to help us as an industry get back to what's really important, what really matters. And what really matters is the product quality, those patient outcomes, not wasting our time, effort, money, resources, people on places where there's not value add, simply for the purpose of checking boxes. It just doesn't help. And as you look through, the new guidances, the new GAMP documentation, you'll see this over and over again. And I love what Sean was saying about them recognizing that we really needed a new term, because as an industry, we're really stuck. We're really stuck in those old ways of thinking. So a risk-based approach considers the risk of compromised safety and or quality of the device to determine the level of assurance, effort, and activities appropriate to establish confidence in the software. Because this effort is risk-based, it follows a least burdensome approach where the burden of validation is no more than necessary to address the risks. Such an approach supports the efficient use of resources, in turn promoting product quality. This is straight from the FDA definition of CSA in the guideline that came out last fall. I can't emphasize enough that we've been very stuck in checking all the boxes and doing all the things without taking the time to really step back and look at it from a bigger picture perspective. So again, as Sean was saying, this is nothing new. This has actually always been an option, but because we didn't, our guidelines were fairly prescriptive around, the IQ, OQ, PQ approach, for example, it was difficult to change the thinking. I run into this very often with folks who've been in the industry a long time. I run into this, frankly, with consultants. We come at all of this from a place of fear. What happens when the FDA walks through the door? Well, I remember two different heads of divisions of the FDA at that conference last fall saying their inspectors are actually trained not to look at QMS software validation packages. It is a waste of their time. They need to be focusing on systems that actually can impact patient risk. Now, that's not to say they're never going to look at it. If you're in a situation where some of your other processes are not working well, and this is the tool you're using, they might get into that level of detail. But that's a whole other problem if you're already there. And the quote directly from Sean himself here, who's on with us, the regulators aren't saying we've defined this big and complex thing called CSA we want you to follow. CSA really means following GAMP truly and dropping all this baggage of unnecessary documentation. Doesn't really matter what it's called, it's about protecting the patient and in the end, increasing the quality of your final product. Sean, anything to add to that?
I'm very pleased that just now you mentioned some industry trends, and you mentioned the work that was happening in GAMP and here in CDRH, and I think you could have added in that diagram the 21st Century Initiative as well from the Centre for Drugs and the wider FDA, because these kinds of messages have been coming from senior regulators for 20 years now. So this is really not nothing new. This focus on quality over compliance, also a reminder that there's a C associated with CGMP. This has been a strong message from FDA over many years, and systems and approaches that may be regarded as adequate or top of the line 15-20 years ago, these methods and approaches that they just don't cut it these days. And just because it was enshrined in a company, an SOP or a policy 20-30 years ago, it doesn't mean that it's required, and it doesn't mean that it's actually acceptable. It's built into the European directives that companies need to take into account modern science and modern technology, and it's an FDA expectation as well. So if companies are not looking at modern software lifecycle approaches and assurance approaches, they're actually not meeting the spirit of the FD&C Act and the European directives. So this is certainly something that a company should do. It's to their great advantage. And if a company chose to ignore current science and apply science that was 30 years old, or technology that was 30 years old, that they would be derelicting their duty really. In doing that, they're not protecting the patient, and they're not really focusing on the quality of the final product.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I love that you brought the European regulations into this as well. We did have someone ask, and again, we are talking a goodly bit here about US FDA, but this absolutely is recognized in Europe as well. It is amazing to me as a software vendor how often I hear people incorrectly apply, I believe it's Annex 11 in the European regulations to their QMS tool.
I would say 15. Apply 15 rather than Annex 11, which you correctly identified here, but 15 rather than 11. It's singularly inappropriate and unhelpful. Yes, agreed.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Annex 15 does not apply to your QMS tool. That is about your manufacturing processes and your manufacturing equipment and computerized systems involved in that. So yes, the short answer is absolutely. European regulators recognize this as well. I would say they're probably better about following GAMP than we are here in the States, in my experience. All right, so what does this look like? And this was, it took me a while when we switched over here at Qualio to following this methodology as opposed to generating IQ, OQ, PQ documentation for our customers. Took me a bit to wrap my brain around it, but once you do, man, you're gonna fly. You're gonna see how much easier this makes everything for you as you go through these processes. And that includes updates to software, change management, customization, all of it gets so much easier in this scenario. So the biggest thing I see when customers walk through our door is identify your intended use. How do you plan to use this software? And that is based on an assumption that you understand your own internal processes. And you don't have to overthink this documentation. Is it a direct part of the production or quality system or a supporting element? Are there multiple uses arising from multiple features, functions, or operations? This does not have to be a large, complicated document. Most of the time, I'm seeing this as, a 1 to 2 pager, maybe some process flowcharts if you like to draw things out. And I know inspectors love to see flowcharts. But how do you plan to use the software? That's an important place to start. And again, I can't emphasize enough, you need to understand your own business needs and your own processes. Ideally, you have those things documented. And if you haven't, you need to get them documented because this is the basis for everything you do going forward. How do you intend to use the software? From there, you will then risk assess. And this is the other place I'm seeing so many questions. Based on the intended use, what is the risk profile of the software and its potential impact on product and patient safety? That's the part the regulators care about. Certainly there are business risks. Absolutely, I appreciate your QMS software goes down, things can't move through the facility, people can't do their jobs. That's a risk, but that's not the highest risk out there. And Sean, this was an area I really wanted your help. Please help us understand, how do we apply risk-based thinking to this?
Great, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this because I'm really passionate about this. There's still quite a lot of misunderstanding in the industry in general about what a risk-based approach is really all about. And no matter, it seems, how well the FDA describe it and how well it's described in GAMP, there still seems to be misunderstanding about what the real objectives are of quality risk management, and then based on that, what the appropriate tools and approach would be. And the bottom line objective is quality risk management is to identify risks that impact product quality and patient safety, and then to control those risks to an acceptable level. And by the way, this is where validation comes in, because there's a great case to be made for defining validation as ensuring that your risk controls are effective. And that's a great angle. That's a great perspective to look at validation. Validation is challenging and checking that your risk controls are effective in managing risks to the patients, to the public, and to product quality. Risk management is not about generating paper. It's not about generating lots of complex outcomes and numbers and doing calculations. And again, kudos to the FDA in the draft guidance. They talk about differentiation between risk management at the process level and medical device level versus the type of risk assessments that would be appropriate for computerized systems. And I think companies fall into the trap of trying to apply complex FMEA type processes with lots of arithmetical elements and models that only really work based on historical data, and trying to apply that when really all they need to do, as you point out, is to identify where the risks are that could be associated with either the system failing to do something or doing something incorrectly, and then identify if they require further controls, what assurance they need to apply to ensure that those controls are working. And it will be a multiple assurance. Some of these checks will be built into the process, some of them will be built into the system, and the additional, let's say, assurance provided by validation will be that remaining part, which may be a lot or a little depending on the absolute level of risk. So I think a lot of it comes down to truly understanding what quality risk management means. There's a lot of good stuff in the draft CSA guide on this, but obviously GAMP has a lot of good guidance on this topic, and so does ICH Q9. So the answers are out there as to what does a real risk-based approach mean.
And so just to kind of help us with, wrapping our brains around that, Sean, I'm thinking high-risk software as things like your building management system that maybe is controlling cross-contamination within areas of your facility, manufacturing equipment that is software controlled or driven, SCADA, in-process monitoring, those kinds of things, that issues with those have direct impact on your product quality. What other examples might you, or do you agree with that?
I agree. It's systems that monitor or control, especially with minimal human interaction, with regards to critical process parameters that might then impact critical quality attributes. So that's one family of high level risks. You have systems that are depended upon for product release, product recall, and then you have the whole safety monitoring, pharmacovigilance, adverse events, things, and systems obviously that are central to regulatory submissions, safety and efficacy submissions. So it's when there is a high impact on the human at some stage, and particularly then when the system is acting somewhat autonomously of the user, and perhaps that there is no subsequent assurance activity, and therefore the consequences of any defects or failures could have that direct impact on the quality of the product or the safety of the patient.
Absolutely. And so in our situation, for example, in an EQMS tool, we might choose, so we would accept the vendor documentation for the baseline validation of the system, but we're also using it for our complaint handling, and within that, our medical device or vigilance reporting problem system, for example. We might consider that particular process to be higher risk than, say, document control or training, for example. And so we might do some additional justification and or testing around our configuration of that specific area of the software, but not the entirety of the system. That's an important distinction. And so we can get into that a little bit more, but as we talk about, managing your configuration in these kinds of systems, you can choose, to do tighter documentation around the areas that do have that higher risk, as opposed to the entirety of the system. That's where this approach gives us a little more freedom and ability to manage it going forward. So again, based on our risk and our understanding of how our intended use of the tool is going to be laid out, we would then determine appropriate assurance activity. How much objective evidence is appropriate for completion and collection based on the risk posed by the software? Will unscripted or ad hoc testing or scripted testing, more robust or limited, be performed, or both? So this is a perfect example where, again, doc control training, supplier management, baseline processes in your system, design control activities, etc., all considered relatively low risk. Lots of things have to happen before that has an impact on product quality or patient safety. But my complaint handling process and the trends that go on within there maybe are a little bit closer. I would argue they're not a direct impact, but they are an indirect impact to patient safety. The handling of that particular information within my software represents a higher risk because there's patient safety involved in that sort of activity. So I would run a tighter configuration document set and some testing around my complaint handling and vigilance reporting processes within my tool, but the rest of it would all be accepted based on vendor testing. That is one way to approach it. So from there, establish an appropriate record of all your assurance activities. Does your record of your CSA activity include the following? Again, intended use. How do you intend to use the software? How does the software support the processes that you're doing in your facility? The determination of risk of the feature, function, or operation. Documentation of the assurance activities conducted, including, description of the testing conducted based on the assurance activity, again, bringing it back to risk. Any issues that you found while you were doing it. A conclusion statement declaring the acceptability of the results. The data of the testing or assessment and the name of the person who conducted it, and an established, review and approval process when appropriate. And this is not only you doing it. This could be the vendor doing it and you reviewing what the vendor has done to cover the areas where you feel there is less risk. So this is not, the assumption here is not that you have done all of this work as the customer. Okay, you can leverage vendor documentation for doing these types of activities. So again, well, I just said this. It's absolutely okay to lean on your suppliers' provided documentation, especially if you aren't doing a lot of configuration and you're using the system pretty much out of the box. You want to document according to system risk and functionality, not what you think your auditor wants to see. Again, this is not an exercise where we're filling in a bunch of checkboxes to make auditors happy. Only create the assurance documents that are of real value to you and tie it all back to intended use of the system and whether or not that use introduces any risks into your process. The FDA doesn't prescribe, and I would argue again, European regulations as well, Do not prescribe any amount of documents precisely because it should be appropriate. It should be appropriate, risk-based, and tailored to your specific use case. They expect you to think about how you're going to use the tool, identify any risks, and then do the documentation as appropriate so that you can mitigate any risks you've identified. Quality management system software that do not directly impact the patient or the product, like document control systems, CAPA systems, complaint handling systems, might only require a supplier qualification if it's used out of the box. And I would add, as a vendor of this, that the vendor would hold that documentation. You would look at it as part of your supplier qualification process. You don't need to have complete copies of everything the vendor has generated. Even if you need to configure, ad hoc testing would be all that's expected. So set up your complaint workflow, as we talked about. Write yourself a little mini protocol, run it through the paces, and make sure everything is as you expect it to be, and you're done. That's literally all you need to do. This means no test plans, no formal requirements, no traceability matrix, no configuration specs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a quote from Sandy Hedberg at USTM Life Sciences, a major consulting firm, again, globally around the world. No IQ, OQ, PQ. I can feel everybody clutching their pearls over this one. IQ, OQ, PQ documentation was borrowed into CSV from older process validation frameworks in the 90s as the industry scratched around for a suitable CSV approach. Again, square peg, round hole. They remain appropriate for simple computerized tools where a linear process of installing, checking operation, and checking performance can be performed. So I saw a couple questions in the box along these lines. How do we know when to do what? IQ, OQ, PQ is still appropriate in some of those situations. Pure software processes and tools really do not fit this model very well. The linear nature of IQ, OQ, PQ processes no longer matches modern nonlinear software development life cycles and tends to produce, again, piles of documents that don't really add any value. So vendors you work with, they don't need to provide IQ, OQ, PQ documents to help you validate their system. Your FDA inspector won't ask to see them. Again, straight from heads of the FDA. European, I would argue, same boat. It'll be interesting to see as we get further and further away from this, change, and I use air quotes to say change. Using them means you aren't adopting agile critical thinking of modern CSA. You're checking boxes for just the sake of doing it. A good vendor will help you drive a sensible quality and regulatory approach. Encouraging you to perform non-value add validation activity means they aren't prioritizing your real operational needs, and they probably haven't done their homework. It's easier for the vendor to throw their hands up and say, well, this isn't my problem. I don't have to determine suitability for use. True, they don't. You have to, but you don't have to do it by repeating all the testing that they've already done. A reputable vendor performs and documents their system assurance activities themselves and should provide it to you as you go live. Use it as the core and probably the majority of your assurance records. If you are familiar with modern software development lifecycle processes, you know that what's happening in the background is detailed documentation, usually in a system like Jira, that is further more detail than what you're going to see in an IQ, OQ, PQ anyway. And they're using automated testing tools as they do all of these activities because the engineers are testing their work before they release it. And generally, if they're a good solid house with a solid SDLC process, those tests are being independently reviewed within the teams before it's ever released, even to a staging environment for more testing. Why would you repeat that? So helpful reading. Again, GAMP 5, updated in July, as well as the Good Practice Guide, Enabling Innovation. I highly recommend both of these documents. Get a copy of them, read them again. Have your IT people read them if you've got a big group. These will really help you figure out the direction you want to head. So in conclusion, 2 stories quickly. What not to do. So you've got a new business coming into existence. They want to bring a life science product to market, or maybe you're an existing business and you're wanting to think about maybe switching over. You know that there's regulatory hurdles and inspections and things you have to get through in order to get to market. And so, you hire a quality manager and they fixate on, well, we've got to check all these boxes. We've got regulatory requirements, compliance needs, and we build our system around those needs and inspect, and always from a place of fear. Well, when the FDA shows up, I love that one. So the effort is spent on getting to the end goal of compliance and rigid clause by clause adherence. They're not really thinking about from a process and a risk perspective. It's actually easier to not think about it from that perspective. You can turn your brain off and check boxes. So the fear of validation means the company either sticks with paper or they generate mountains of documents to show IQ, OQ, PQ type stuff and big complex risk assessments based on, FMEA calculations and all that kind of stuff. Because again, mountains of information must mean the system's good, right? So the auditor arrives, they find vast effort has been spent building all of this validation packages, et cetera, and you've done this for every single system in your facility. There's no direct risk to patient safety from these systems. They're not going to waste their time reviewing it. And so meanwhile, high levels of paper and manual process make it difficult to get to the information, focus on the areas they are there to see. The regulators are there to protect the patient and to consider, product quality, patient safety, right? Those things actually hurt people. And so if you've got mountains of paper for things that don't do that, they're going to see that you aren't focused in the right area. So again, it just detracts from value add activities. You never really can get to a place of continuous improvement because you don't have time. You don't have time to step back and look at everything. So in CSA, again, company comes into existence, they know they've got to meet these regulations, but instead of generating mountains of paper, they build their quality management system around continuous improvement, and they're always focused on, does this impact my product or does this impact the patient? And anything that does not have direct impact, it's not to say it's not addressed, but you just don't need to go to that level of detail. You can take some risk here. You can accept vendor documents. You can look at, smaller, shorter qualification activities around areas that maybe do have that kind of impact. So again, and really in a good quality system, you have the opportunity to do continuous improvement, and you're looking at things always from that quality, data integrity, patient safety perspective. Sensible risk-based assessment of EQMS platforms from established industry vendors means computerized system assurance can be performed quickly with minimal burden, rather than generating an unnecessary protective layer of compliance documentation themselves. They can lean on vendors' own testing activities and perform additional testing if they feel it's necessary. The auditor arrives, finds an appropriate level of documentation and effort, and the auditor can spend their time really looking at the areas that matter. And again, doing this also not on paper makes everything a lot easier. Eliminate fear-based compliance work means the auditor can detect clear value add quality activity and strong management of high-risk systems and processes. The auditor will be a lot more confident in your systems this way. So I'm going to zoom a little bit here because we're getting near the end and I want to make sure we have a few minutes for your questions. Regulators want you to digitize. CSA is about making it easier. Make quality, not compliance, the guiding factor. Again, checkboxes are not making your product better. Software vendors assume the bulk of the responsibility. They're already testing those systems before they release them. Why are you repeating it, especially in a cloud-based multi-tenant situation? Risk is everything. An EQMS does not need the same assurance vigor as an adverse event reporting system. Adverse events directly can have impact on patient safety directly. They expect you to be tracking and trending, etc. Don't work with vendors stuck in outdated validation activities. They're handing you mountains of documents. They're not really staying current with industry thinking. Don't be afraid of your audits. Build in-house understanding of CSA. We have tons of great information on this available on our website. Get a copy of GAMP, get a copy of the guidance, on enabling innovation. It's a little bit of a shift in thinking if you've done CSV for years, but I promise it is an effort worth making. Industry guidance is remarkably consistent. Do your reading. Definitely read. Critical thinking is the golden thread tying your assurance work together, which activity in which areas and to what extent. Tie it back to risk, and don't waste time retesting things over and over. Focus on the areas that matter. All right, I kind of zoomed there at the end, but we've got a lot of really great questions in here. So
can I jump in and answer a few rapidly, because I know you've been busy. I've been monitoring the questions. I've picked some that I think I can answer quickly and maybe to help here. So I'll just take 4 or 5 to begin with. An anonymous attendee asked, if no IQ/OQ, does that mean the software V model is no longer applicable? Well, first thing I would say is the V model is really more of a relationship diagram showing how these things relate to each other rather than being a workflow. But a traditional linear V model approach is still appropriate if you know all the requirements up front and you can deliver everything all at once. It's just not appropriate if you have an incremental or an iterative approach where a circular or a spiral model is more appropriate. So if you know everything up front and it is a straight linear approach, there's no problem using that. There's a question from Stephen about part 11. A very straight question at the end there. Is it reasonable to retire antiquated part 11 box checking lists? Absolutely. The approach as described by Kelly, by FDA in the guidance, is to take a process driven approach based on intended use, top down, based on the process, looking for threats, vulnerabilities, etc. So is it reasonable to retire part 11 box checking lists? Yes. The guidance does refer you to the scope and application guide, which describes a risk-based and narrow scope-based approach to part 11. Richard asked, and I'm rattling through questions here with just a brief answer, but I'd like to cover as many as I can. Richard asked, what can you recommend if you can to automate CSA itself? There's so many opportunities here. Anything that we use to automate the whole of the computerized system lifecycle helps to do this, and some of them are mentioned in the draft CSA guide. So we can manage requirements, as Kelly's talked. We can define specifications. We can help design. We can automate test planning. We can automate test developing. We can manage incidents. We can monitor in operation. So basically, all normal software sector tools that are intended and have been designed to manage software life cycles, they're all supporting this objective of using appropriate tools to support the GXP regulated systems so that they meet their intended use. Sandy raised a good one, and I will stop in a minute, but Sandy raised a very good point about the misimpression perhaps that CSA is a replacement for CSA. And as Randy says, CSA provides a model for making better decisions about how to make an appropriate approach for verification. So it's, the CSA is making some very valuable philosophical general points of where we want to be, and in order to help achieve those objectives, it then focuses particularly on appropriate assurance approaches within that wider framework. It doesn't try to replace or unestablish current existing practice that if it's good practice that's currently called CSV. Graham, just very quickly, Graham raises a good one. The way GAMP looks at the world in detail and the way that the CSA guidance looks at the world is very similar in that we have both have a spectrum of risk. It's just the way that that's broken up in the guidance is slightly different, in that FDA take a binary. It's either high process risk or it's not, and then they have three major groups: direct, supporting, and none, in terms of validation. Whereas in the GAMP world, there's a little bit more discrimination between perhaps high, medium, and low, and then there's category 1, which is regarded as non-GXP. But that's really detail. GAMP would say the ITSM tool is category 1. It's non-GXP, therefore it requires qualification. So apply good practices. If we use the CSA logic, it's a different way of thinking about it, but we get to the same end result. The square quotes validation required for something like that disappears to the very small amount, because of all the existing multiple assurance aspects in place, and also the very low impact. So it's a difference in detail, but the overall end result is the same, and the overall spectrum of risk approach is the same. So back to you, Kelly. I thought I'd try and answer as many questions as I could in a short period.
That's great. Thank you. And I think too, as I was thinking about this, one of the things I remind people when I get into conversations about this, the whole point of validation in general is, what do you need a system to do? How is it built to do those things? And what testing or activities have been done that prove that what you built meets the requirements of the system. So software development lifecycle, very much parallel to design control in the medical device industry. We take a requirement: the system must control my documents. It must give me a platform for document control. I have a list of functions that do that thing, right? I can create a document, I can edit a document, I can approve a document, blah, 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 right? We break it down. And then I have the tests. And as a software vendor, we've done those tests, and we have an automated tool that does them over and over again. Literally every time we touch the code in our tool, that automated system runs that entire battery of tests every time. So while your validation is a snapshot in time for the one time you looked at it, my system is testing it 2, 3, 4, 10 times a day, depending on how often code commits happen. And that cycle is over and over and over again. That is validation. Does the system meet intended use? What is my intended use? Here are the requirements. Here's what I've built. Here's how they meet those requirements. That is not IQ, OQ, PQ. And there is a lot of opportunity in how you scale and grow that, or scale it back, depending on what you're doing with the system. So we're a few minutes over time. You guys are amazing. Thank you for all these questions. We will pull these down and go through. I'll work with Sean on them to get some answers to you guys, and we'll follow up with you. We will also send the slide deck out as part of the follow-up communication, and keep the comms going. If you've got questions, I'm available, Sean's available. We're around on LinkedIn. The Qualio website has a lot of really great information. We've written kind of what we call, GAMP, the GAMP cliff notes, if you will, to try to help you get some more ideas on how to implement this in your facility, and keep the conversation going. And yes, this is in Europe as well. I can't emphasize enough. This is also in Europe. This is not just a US thing. GAMP is a globally recognized guidance. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much, Sean. I really appreciate you joining me on this, and you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.